Well, some of you have heard the story before, but it was a Sunday morning where my mom and I think one of my sisters were not well, and they had stayed at home, and I'd gone to church alone with my dad on that Sunday morning. And there was a fellowship time after the morning service, and we call it bump and spill time. Everybody's got a cookie in one hand and their Bible in the other hand and a cup of coffee or a glass of juice, and we chat and we talk together. And on this given Sunday morning, because my mother wasn't there, I was running around getting into trouble, and my dad eventually got upset. He came over to find me in the middle of the crowd. He grabbed me by an arm, and he sat me on a chair by the edge of the fellowship hall, and he said, "You sit here, and you don't move, and you don't say a word till I come to get you." And I sat there obediently, and I didn't say a word, and I didn't move a muscle. And as the coffee time came to an end, and as people started leaving and streaming out, and the lights got turned off, and the door got closed, and my dad headed out the door, and I heard the key in the door, and I thought, that's it. I'm in trouble. I got to stay here till the evening service. And I was there sitting quietly alone in the dark for about 45 minutes when I heard the key in the door, and I just prayed it was Dad. Dad came in, and he looked at me and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "You told me to sit here and not to move but you saw me leaving. You told me not to move. You told me not to say a word. Get in the car." So we got in the car and we drove home, and as I did the math in my head, I figured that Dad must have gotten almost all the way home before he realized he'd forgotten me. And as we pulled into the driveway the second time, Dad turns off the engine and he looks at me, and I'll never forget, and he says, "Your mother doesn't need to know I forgot you at church." There's this moment in Genesis 22 when God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son, the miracle little boy of the promise of God. And I've often wondered that as God spoke to Abraham and he took Isaac and he headed for the mountain, I've often wondered what he said to Sarah. I wonder if Sarah knew where they were headed. And I wonder, as they were coming back home and God had provided a sacrifice in the place of Isaac, I wonder as they came down to the foot of the mountain whether Abraham reached over, looked at Isaac and said, "Your mother doesn't need to know what almost just happened on the mountain." But the piece, more seriously, that I've often wondered about, as Isaac was making his way up the mountain with his dad, and we're told that he's carrying the firewood, I wonder at what point the lights came on and Isaac realized what his dad was about to do. At one point he turns to his dad and he said, "Dad, you've got the fire, I've got the firewood, where's the sacrifice?" And Abraham says, "God will provide." And I wonder at what point the lights came on and Isaac realized what his dad was about to do. We celebrated last week in the tail end of Hebrew 4 and the beginning of Hebrew 5 the fact that we have a great high priest. And tonight we consider the corollary to that a great high priest needs to have a great sacrifice to offer. And as we'll discover, the Lord himself will be the sacrifice. But it wasn't a surprise to him. He didn't find out partway up the mountain like Isaac following Abraham. He came for this purpose to present himself as a sacrifice. Jesus not only knew that it was coming from the moment he was born, he knew beforehand. He knew from eternity past. He knew through the whole period of the Old Testament that this is what was waiting for him. Let's look at our text together. Hebrews 10, verses 1 to 10. "For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshippers, having once been cleansed, could no longer have any consciousness of sins. But in these sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin." I want to stop there for a second. One of the oldest homes that Debbie and I tried to renovate was an old Victorian home, an old 3-story home in Farnham in the Eastern Townships. And Before we bought it, there's a couple who tried to renovate it. They'd owned it just for a year when we bought it from them. But before them, the house had been owned by three sisters, three elderly ladies who were living in the house alone, and they were trying to keep the house together. And they were short of means, and they were short of abilities and skills. And so they would hire local contractors to keep fixing the house as best as they could. And on this strange three-story house, there were peaked roofs and buttresses and all kinds of strange shapes to the roof. And so the roof had all of these gullies and valleys, and a bunch of them would leak. And they couldn't afford to replace the roof. They couldn't afford to get it reshingled. So there's a local contractor that'd get to come out every year or two to put another layer of tar on all the places that were leaking. And 2 years later, the roof would leak again, and he'd come in to put another layer of tar. And it would leak again, and come in and put another layer of tar. And he'd come in again and put another layer of tar. And so after we bought the house, one of the first things we had to do before we wasted any money on the inside that would get ruined by the rain, we had to replace the shingles on the roof. And so we went up on the roof, and some of the areas on the roof, there was almost 1.5 inches of tar, layer after layer after layer after layer, a temporary fix after another, a temporary fix after another. And what the text tells us tonight is that the Old Testament sacrifices were a temporary fix. They didn't deal with the problem of sin. They put another little piece, another little coating of tar on the leak, and another little piece of tar on the leak, and another little piece of tar on the leak, and another little piece of tar on the leak. And these opening verses actually paint quite an indictment of the law. The law, we are told, wasn't the true form of the realities to come. It's not even that they were a shadow of the things to come. It says that they had just a little shadow of the things to come. So somewhere there in the middle of this whole law thing, there are bits and pieces that served a purpose by faintly pointing to the good things that were to come. In the end, the problem with the law, the shortcoming it has, is that there's something that absolutely needs to be done that it cannot do. At the end of verse 1, the writer says the law can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered year after year, make perfect those who draw near. It can't fix the problem. And in spite of repeated sacrifices every year, year after year, in spite of endless rituals, the law could not make perfect those who offered them. But it goes a step further. It actually says that the law was a powerful 1-2 punch. In verse 3, these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year. And secondly, in verse 4, it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. So here's the double punch of the law. First, it tells you, you're a sinner, and there's nothing I can do about it. You're a sinner, and there's nothing I can do about it. Every year, it reminds you that you're a sinner, but it's incapable to do anything about it. We saw last week that there was a problem with the law because there was this ordinary human high priest that had to first offer a sacrifice for his own sins. So last week we dealt with this problem. Let's get a better high priest. We got a better high priest. We got a great high priest in the person of Jesus Christ. Tonight we need to deal with the other piece. We need to find the perfect sacrifice. And so verse 5 begins with the word consequently. Because there's this need that the law absolutely can't fix. Consequently, in response to that, Christ came into the world. In other words, Christ comes into the world in response to this desperate need of ours, a need that all the rituals of the Old Testament could not fix. Verse 5, consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, in here, there's an extended quote from Psalm 40, he said, quote, sacrifices and offerings you've not desired, but a body have you prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. When he said above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings. These are offered according to the law. Then he added, behold, I have come to do your will. He does away with the first in order to establish the second. And by that will, we've been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There are a couple of background issues with the quote from Psalm 40 that we need to deal with. The psalm was written by David. It begins with an expression of thanksgiving, but eventually it turns to this lament about the law. And the strange thing is that it's addressed to the choir master, which suggests that this psalm was written to be read and used in public worship in the temple. Given that, it's strange that David should say that God takes no pleasure in burnt offerings and sin offerings, that he's not desired sacrifices and offerings. This was a hymn that was meant to be sung while they're offering sacrifices and ritual offerings. Kind of strange. It's like if when we came to church on Sunday morning, we sang a hymn that says, God, we know you don't like it when we come to church, but here we are. And this kind of forces the issue and compels us to deal with one of the central questions at the heart of our text tonight. If all these Old Testament sacrifices were so ineffective, if they were as ineffective as the writer claims they were in verses 1 and 2, if they were just a yearly reminder of sin and they couldn't deal with the sin or make us perfect, and if on top of that God takes no pleasure, no delight in them, why were they still offered for thousands of years? What God was after was not the outward ritual, but the heart of obedience that motivated the offering. Without the obedient heart, the ritual was empty. There's this moment in this great quote from 1 Samuel 15. King Saul leads the people against the Amalekites, and they have this great victory. But when Saul went against the Amalekites, God gave them instructions. You're going to go against the Amalekites. You're going to beat them. And when you've conquered them, you don't take any booty. This is foul stuff. It's immoral stuff. They're idolaters. You're going to slaughter all of the cattle. You're going to kill the king. You're putting these people away. And Saul goes in. They win this great victory. They kill all the soldiers. But there's these beautiful cattle and these great-looking sheep. It would be a shame to waste all this. And they let the king survive. And when Samuel arrives, Saul says, "Hey, Samuel, look, we followed the Lord's instructions." And Samuel, who's got a gift for sarcasm, says, "Well, what's all the bleating of sheep I hear and all those oxen? What are all those animals if you followed the Lord's instructions?" And Saul plays dumb. He says, "We saw these great animals. We thought it would be a shame not to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. So we disobeyed the Lord, but it's because we want to take these animals and offer them to the Lord as sacrifice." And then Samuel responds with the quote that you've heard before, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams." And if you allow me a parenthesis just for a moment, there's a heavy and a significant parenthesis for us here. Even though these sacrifices and rituals had been ordained by God in the details of the law, God ordained rituals. When they were offered by people whose hearts were not right, when they had become merely an empty external ritual, they brought God no pleasure and he had no desire for them. And that always leads me to a heavy question about what we do when we come to church to worship together. Sadly, many Christian people think that God is pleased merely by the external act. I came to church today, I sang the hymns, I recited the creed, I listened to the sermon, and I put some money in the offering. Done my job. God's happy with me. I'm going to tell you, God has no desire for these. These external rituals give God no pleasure. He's after what's happening in your heart. If they are not the fruit of an obedient, consecrated heart, God has no desire, no pleasure in them. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen better than the fat of rams. And judging by the words in Psalm 40, it's clear that David has understood this. And he's understood that God takes greater pleasure in obedience than in empty rituals. And even if these sacrifices had been prescribed by the law, understanding that priority, David offers to God not just a sacrifice, but his full obedience, and he expresses his heart's burning desire to do the will of God. And the writer of Hebrews takes the words of David and places them prophetically into the mouth of Christ at the moment of his incarnation, expressing his willingness to fully do the will of God, even as far as offering his very self as the perfect sacrifice. Now, there's a strange thing that happens. If you turn back to the Old Testament and you look at Psalm 40, it reads a little differently than the quote in the book of Hebrews. The quote in the book of Hebrews is quoting from the Septuagint, from the Greek version of the Old Testament. So there's another language in between. Our English Bibles go from the Hebrew to the English. And the text in the New Testament goes from the Hebrew to the Greek, possibly the Aramaic, into the English. So there's another layer of language in there. And the reading is a little different. In Psalm 40, verse 6, he says, "In sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear." And in going from the Greek, from the Hebrew to the Greek to the English, the fact that God had given him an open ear to listen and to hear and to do his will becomes a wider application. You've given me not just an ear, but you've given me a whole body with which to do your will. And this, after all, is why he had come. But unlike poor Isaac, who may well have begun the long, hard walk up the mountain with his father Abraham as an unwitting fill-in for the missing sacrifice, Jesus knew exactly why he had come. And David in Psalm 40 says that as he comes, he says, "Here I am to do your will." And he knew why he had come because the scroll of the book speaks about him and about the offering of himself. The scroll of the book, the whole Old Testament speaks about him. The scroll of the law, which prescribed these pointless sacrifices that could not atone for sins, they actually pointed forward to the good things in Jesus Christ. The scroll of the Psalms and the other poetic books, they foreshadow his coming as a sacrifice for sin. The scrolls of the prophets, from Isaiah to all of the others, they predict with this miraculous accuracy the route that he would take as he would be the sheep, silently and willingly led to slaughter for you and I. And when he comes in the flesh, this goal was foremost in his mind. John tells us that he set his face as a flint, as a hard rock towards Jerusalem. There's Jerusalem. There's the cross. That's where I'm going. And he didn't turn from it to the left or to the right. In Mark 9, 10, and 11, there's these three pillars at the heart of the gospel. There's Jesus' three predictions of his death. Mark 9, we're going to Jerusalem. They're going to kill me. Mark 10, we're going to Jerusalem. They're going to kill me. Mark 11, we're going to Jerusalem. They're going to kill me. The Son of Man is going to die. And then after the fact in Luke, on the Emmaus Road, Jesus with those two disciples who were leaving Jerusalem discouraged, it tells us that he took them to the Old Testament and he proved to them from the Old Testament that the Messiah had to come and suffer and die. Jesus knew all of this before he came. I told you when we started our little three-part series in Hebrews that each one of the texts we would consider would speak clearly of the incarnation and the need for it, and of the need for Christ to be truly human and truly divine. And here's the clincher tonight. As Jesus comes in the flesh, he improves on the Old Testament sacrifices in two critical ways. First, the Old Testament sacrifices were incomplete because it was impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins, because those sacrifices were not valuable enough, because the blood of a bull and the blood of a goat and of an ox and of a sheep is worth less than the life of a human being. So Jesus, the divine Son of God, had to come physically in flesh, body, bone, and blood to offer a much more valuable sacrifice that can and that does and that has taken away sin once and for all, because it took the precious blood of his one and only Son for God's righteousness to be satisfied and for his wrath to be appeased. And for the first time, here is at last a sacrifice. Here is at last an offering with which he is pleased. All the other sacrifices weren't worth enough. They weren't valuable enough to even equal the life of one human being. But this one is worth infinitely more. The second reason why God is pleased with the sacrifice is not just because of the value of the blood that's offered. It's also because it is offered in full obedience to the will of God. You remember what was wrong with those Old Testament sacrifices? Two things were wrong with them. They weren't valuable enough, and the people who offered them weren't obeying. Their heart wasn't right. When Christ comes and offers himself, offers his body as a sacrifice for sin, it's not just that the sacrifice is worthwhile. It's not just that the sacrifice is worthy. It's not just that the sacrifice is valuable enough. It is that it is offered in full and complete surrender and submission to the will of God. Not just at that very moment as Jesus fully submitted to the Father's will, but at every moment before. And so the Lord Jesus comes as the ultimate, valuable, precious sacrifice, and he comes willingly, obediently, submitting to the Father's will. Thank God for the incarnation. Thank God that Jesus Christ came in the flesh to do the Father's will to the end. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, "Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure." Then I said, "Behold, I have come to do your will, O God. It is written of me in the scroll of the book. Behold, I have come to do your will." And by that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. One complete, perfect sacrifice of infinite value offered in submission to the Father's will. This is the incarnation of Christ. Amen.